Welcome everyone to the Trail Talk Tuesdays, the first of a series of six talks that we're going to have, webinars that we are hosting, thanks to sponsorship from the Sunflower Foundation, who has underwritten this effort, and with great, huge thanks to the Kansas Trails Council for their content expertise. We couldn't have done it without them. The call is being recorded, and you will get a link to the recording after it's posted. We are going to give you a 3-question survey at the end, just to figure out whether or not this is making a difference, whether we're hitting the mark on our content. So we're going to teach to the test, and the test is this. Number 1, did you learn something today that you can use immediately? Number 2, how many people will you forward this information to? And number 3, what did you learn today that was most helpful to you? And that will just be automatic at the end of the call. So you'll get that. I hope you'll think about that as we're talking. So first off is Mike Goodwin. There are over 3,000 miles of trails in Kansas. Oops, let me share my screen here. There are over 3,000 miles of trails in Kansas, and more are being created every day. But if you want to build a trail, where do you start? And that's the purpose of this call. Mike Goodwin is with the Kansas Trails Council, and he is here to answer those basic questions. Mike has been designing and building trails for 24 years and has worked with hundreds of aspiring trail builders across the state. He has worked with park managers and trail volunteers from the beginning of a project through the end of construction. Mike, what should we consider in the early days of developing a new trail?
Well, thank you, Nancy. And thank everybody for joining us today. It's going to be a lot of fun to talk about trails. And it will be fun to talk about different aspects of trails throughout the next webinars, the other 5 after today. So the very first thing, and Nancy, do you want to go to the next slide, possibly? There we go. Early on, when you're thinking about building a trail, I mean, clearly, we don't have a lot of public land in the state, so you have to find some place where a trail could be built where there would be public access allowed. And so this is really where you begin to scout your area, your town, your city, or your county or nearby to really find some place where there's not a trail, where you could put a trail. I'm finding as we talk to people around the state lately, people are putting trails like behind the courthouse, just like a 1/3 of a mile walking trail, so people at lunchtime could walk for recreation. Museums, libraries, other public building sites. But of course, parks are probably the predominant location that you'd want to look for. One type of location you might not think about immediately are creeks. Almost every town has a creek flowing through it where there's often a public easement surrounding the creek on both sides. If you are careful, you could always build a trail along a creek in that easement. And so it's worth looking at, all kinds of different locations that would have some kind of public access. When you're looking for sites, obviously you might know your community really well from a personal standpoint, and driving around looking at places, it gives you a lot of ideas. There are some online tools also. Google Earth is a really helpful one to find parks and possible locations for trails. There's also a website called ORCA, ORKA, which I believe stands for Open Records for Kansas Appraisers. And on that website, you can actually drill down county by county. You can drill down to particular parcels of land. And so you can actually find a particular location and click on it, and it will tell you whether it's owned privately or possibly it's in the public good. So it's a real helpful tool when you're trying to do some of the research online, as opposed to driving around looking for sites. And, I will say also, and Myron's going to talk about this in a little while, but there are some occasions when private landowners have decided to allow public access trails on their land. And so this is something that's beginning to happen in Kansas on a very small scale, but it is beginning to happen. And so stay tuned for that. And Myron's going to talk about some of the challenges he encountered in building one of those trails a little later on this morning. So after you find a place to build a trail, then you need to consider a few things about the trail itself. Look at my notes here. So when you're building a trail, you kind of have to ask yourself in the early stages, what's the purpose of the trail? What's the goal of building this trail? And there are really a lot of reasons why people build trails, but some of which you might not think of initially. Obviously, the first one, recreation, fitness, walking, running, and biking. Those are clearly sort of normal reasons to build a trail. Getting out in nature, obviously, is just kind of a side benefit of all of that. Building trails that sort of address environmental education, uh, historic and cultural education and awareness. You might build a trail to commemorate someone in your family or in the neighborhood or in the city or town. So there are a lot of reasons we might build a trail. I've run across a couple of them. There's a trail, I believe it's in Parsons, that is basically an art trail where there are some enormous limestone sculptures of various things, including about a 30-foot diameter turtle. And it's really kind of an interesting trail to go see if you haven't seen it. I think it's the Tolan Creek Trail. So you might think about all of those reasons to build a trail, and it might give you some ideas about, where to build one as well. The next thing you need to think about would be who's going to use the trail. Clearly, hikers, runners, mountain bikers, equestrians, or perhaps combinations of all of those would potentially be using your trail. But you need to think about which users you're going to build the trail for, because each trail type, each trail user type really does prefer a specific trail design often. For example, if you had an urban trail around a city park, you might want to contemplate people with strollers, with children, and so therefore you'd want a fairly durable surface. Runners, for example, often prefer natural surface trails as opposed to gravel or concrete. So those are some things to think about as you decide on trail type and trail design and trail surface types. As far as surface types go, there are really four. Natural or dirt is probably the most common. I think there are about 1,000 miles of natural surface trails in the state. So out of that 3,000 Nancy mentioned, they're about 1/3 or so are natural surface. But then you move into some kind of hardening on the surface, gravel being probably the next most common. And by gravel, I mean limestone screenings typically. And then, of course, the two hardened surface types would be asphalt and concrete. And I might just mention that there's a trade-off between each trail type and the amount of funding necessary or the type of effort that needs to be made. On natural surface trails, it's mostly labor with some specialized tools. So it's not something that really requires a lot of capital, although you do occasionally have bridges and you have culverts and things of that sort. And of course, you always have kiosks and maps and things of that sort. When you move into limestone screenings, it needs to be really well designed, paying attention to your grades, because limestone, even though packed down, can erode with water that's sweeping across the trail. So you need to really carefully design the limestone screenings. But again, it's now more materials and some labor because you have to lay down the screenings. But it's a little less labor intensive, little because it's done with machinery typically, than the natural surface trail. With asphalt and concrete, those are clearly more durable surfaces. And so they're going to have a longer life than the natural surfaces. And they're obviously then therefore going to be more costly. And so asphalt is going to be a little shorter life than concrete because it will tend to crack and shift. And in order to replace an asphalt trail that has deteriorated, you pretty much have to remove everything and start over again. Concrete obviously is the most durable and also the most costly. And I will say one thing to keep in mind, a lot of local contractors could do asphalt or concrete to build your trail, but not many of them know how to lay out the trail, how to design a trail so that it recognizes the engineering that we all talk about. So you may want to consider designing the trail, the location of the trail, the layout of the trail, and then contacting local contractors who could actually add the either asphalt or limestone screenings as well, or concrete. So let me give you a couple of overall tips. I just think it's important early on to find a trail champion who's willing to take on the trail project and see it from start to finish, basically. You need to have someone who's so energized that they're committed to getting this trail done in your locale. So somebody in your town or county who's a trail champion, you need to sign them up. And there may be more than one, but you at least need to have one who's dedicated to making the trail happen. And
Mike,
secondly, yeah,
Mike,
almost
thank
done.
you.
One
We're
more,
out
one
of
more thought,
time.
Nancy. One
Yeah.
more thought, Nancy. Find somebody who has trailblazing experience, and we can help you with that, hopefully. Our contact info can be found on the screen. Well, I think Nancy's going to do that later.
Yep, that was one oversight we made. We'll add that to the follow-up. So thank you, Mike. We knew this was going to be a challenge to do it on our timing. Lacey Lease is the finance director for the City of Independence, and she's currently working with volunteers to develop new trails and city parks. Lacey, will you tell us about your planned trail projects and the issues you've been considering as you're moving forward?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Nancy. If you could advance to the next slide for me. So I'm just going to kind of take you through the process that the City of Independence has gone through in our trails journey. You know, the city knew that we always wanted to build trails, but and I think the reason the city wants to build trails is the same reason that all of us trail enthusiasts want to build trails. And so we really looked at what's the goal of the trail. In our particular instance, didn't necessarily start with the city. Really, it was a group of community members that wanted to make a difference and wanted to collaborate with the city to make it happen, because there was a lot of just talking about it, but not actually doing it. And so we looked at 4 main pillars of why, because just as Mike said, you got to start with the why. And so that was health and wellness, access to free recreation, quality of life, and tourism was important to the city, but maybe less important to a trail enthusiast. So for us, it really started with the Sunflower Trails Champion cohort. I see Elizabeth is on this call. You were instrumental in getting us off the ground in our trail efforts, so thank you for that. But the core cohort was just an opportunity put together by the Sunflower Foundation to help us expand our knowledge, get connections, learn about all of the different ways that you can build trails, whether it's, you know, a DIY strategy, learning about the different economic factors of trails and how to pitch it to cities and communities. So we learned a lot from that course. And in addition to everything we learned in the actual materials of the course, really, what I see as one of the biggest factors is it brought a group of us who didn't know each other really beforehand together to champion trails in our community. Within the group, we started with the where. So we looked at a whole bunch of different options of where could we build trails in the community. And we did a fun exercise where we basically all got together and we had some just basic mapping software, and we plugged in every place within our community from our own perspectives of where we wanted a trail. And so we had, bike lanes, we had mountain bike trails, we had walking trails, every different type of trail was represented on this map that we put together. And then from that map, we kind of asked ourselves all of the questions. If we're going to approach the city to build a trail, which of these trails is most important to us to get off the ground first? And so we talked about how each of those trails would meet the goal of the city. So, quality of life, a tourist attraction, some place that would be used heavily to benefit the overall health and wellness of the community. So we asked those questions for every single trail on our wish list. And we kind of landed on the Central Park Sports Complex Trail. It's a centralized location. It was part of a larger overall project that had already had community support and some funding. It's a trail that we thought we could write grants for because it's a kind of a high profile project in our community, and a trail that had the potential to be attractive to everyone, not just a certain sector or subgroup of trail enthusiasts. So that was important to us. It's located in an underserved neighborhood. It's central in our community. It's close to schools. It's close to downtown. It's close to our park and zoo. And we felt that the trail would lead to increased use and increased visibility of other outdoor recreation opportunities. So it would be likely to be used any given day of the week. Quick walk around the trail on a work day, after work, weekend use, during soccer or baseball practice, really a trail that everyone could get behind. And I say all that because this, although it's probably not necessarily the first trail ever in our community, we've not had investment in trails since. And so from the perspective of the city, so the land manager for this trail, we had to make sure that we were hitting all of the highlights and the important factors for the group that we were pitching this to. So after we picked that location, we started drilling down into more specifics. So for us, the trail was, on city-owned property, tagged on, connected on to a project that the city was kind of already pursuing with revitalizing, renovating and expanding our sports complex area. But we had to say who would build the trail. Because of all those factors, that was an easy question for us. We were able to add it on to the city's project, and so we knew we would have contractors building the trail for us. As far as what type of surface would be needed, this particular location is located in a flood zone. So we knew that we wanted to have a hard surface trail. We knew we wanted it to be used. We wanted it to be easy to use for strollers, and fully ADA accessible because it is around our sporting complex. Then on funding, based on the trail that we chose, we knew that it would be a costly project. It's a 1.1 mile, 8-foot wide concrete trail. And so we set off looking for funding opportunities, grant opportunities to help make it our dream a reality. So we were, through our connections with the Sunflower Trails cohort, we were able to obtain a Sunflower Foundation Trails grant, as well as a Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks Land and Water Conservation grant. We also applied for other grants, such as the Recreational Trails grant through Wildlife and Parks, but we were not successful in that one. We also tapped into Blue Cross Blue Shield's Pathways grant. So we definitely stacked our funding. A lot of research and a lot of people came together to make that happen. We also had a lot of community support and successful campaigning efforts to get it off the ground as well. Again, for us, our focus for the group was to build a framework of what trails could look like in Independence. So that's why we started with a very centralized multi-purpose trail. And support for that trail morphed into other ideas and lit fires under other groups for spinoff trails, which is exactly what we wanted out of our efforts. So from the trails cohort, from the start of our Central Park Trail project, the Eagle Rock Shredders group was working with us through what would it take to build a mountain bike trail in this this section of land just adjacent to the Central Park that is it's just a wooded area. It's not used for anything. It's along the Verdigris River. It floods all the time. It's used for nothing. And they said, we've always wanted to build a trail there. It's on our wish list. It's on that master plan we all created. How do we make it happen? And I mean, it was a pretty easy question to answer for me. I said, well, I think first step is we ask. And so we put together a quick PowerPoint presentation and we presented it at a commission meeting. And the group was given permission to build the trail just adjacent to the Central Park Sports Complex. It was built with volunteer manpower and some local Kubota dealer. And so I think we began construction in September, and we had a grand opening event in May where over 150 people showed up to check out the trail. And it was a great event. We had some other community partnerships come and put on some bike safety awareness and gave bike helmets away and things like that. So it was just it was a great spinoff of all of those initiatives, and something that wasn't the number one trail that we had picked to start with, but it actually got completed before our first pick, which is great. Another spinoff. Yes.
I see we're running out of time and I'm trying to balance. You've got so much content, but maybe we can come back to you in a little bit at the end.
Okay, I will wrap up by just saying another spinoff of our initiative was our Rural Champion grant through the Department of Commerce. We have a rural champion now dedicated to trail efforts in our community with a lot of great things coming up. It's kind of morphed into a second year with our Ad Astra Trail Collective. So we got a lot of good things coming in Independence.
Fantastic. And that's just a good example of the fact that the more energy you start, the more you generate. So next is Nancy Nelson, who is currently managing the development of the Osage Cuesta Trail, rail trail from Fredonia to Chanute. And the project has tremendous support from the community. Nancy, how have you been able to engage stakeholders and generate so much positive energy around your trail?
I think one of the most important things, which is a word that really nobody likes to hear, is homework. But I think it's really important to start out and to educate yourself and your volunteers with a lot of the trail aspects. And those things would be know the location, know your starting point, your ending point, know the communities that you're going to pass through. Even if they are defunct communities, there are still typically groups of people that have a vested interest in the history of the area. So familiarize yourself with the trail and the area that it's going to traverse. The second thing would be make sure you're aware of the intended usage. Is it going to be a bike trail? Is it going to be a hiking trail? Will there be equestrian use? Those things will play into what type of surface you want to have and what type of considerations you have on bridge railings that you need to construct, bridges that you may need to go under, those types of things. The other thing would be the legalities. Know how that land was acquired. Was it eminent domain? Was it deeded from an entity such as a railroad company to a conservancy to be developed? Was it purchased? You need to know all of the legalities. The other thing would be funding. Who is going to fund this trail? Is this going to be tax dollars? Is it going to be grant funds? Is there going to be sales tax? This is all just the type of homework that you need to do so that you can educate your volunteers so that you're able to answer questions from the community or from your volunteers or from media sources. You can answer them intelligently and feel confident knowing that you know all aspects of the trail. The other thing that I feel is important is have an idea of the community's perception of the trail. There are so many misinformed adjacent landowners or community just community advocates. They just don't really understand what a trail can do for a community. So feel that out first and know if it's positive, whether it's neutral, know what you're getting into. One of the things that we did try to do, or I tried to do for our volunteers, was put together a list of frequently asked questions that I thought they would encounter from the communities. Some of the answers may have applied more to Fredonia than in Chanute, because our actual work started in Fredonia. So naturally we had more questions from that area. But even some of our partners, people that were partnering with us in Fredonia, like the Healthy Pathways people, she'd ask me, she goes, people are asking me questions and I don't know how to answer them. So we tried to put together just maybe 10 talking points, trying to recall questions that people had asked us so that we could give some of our community partners or even some of the local government an idea of what questions they may be approached and how they can answer them. That could be about ownership. It could be about physical and mental health. It could be about the economic impact, but it's just better to have more information than not enough. Also, I think it's important when you have a group of volunteers that are going to come together and build these trails, once you all talk and kind of educate yourselves together, I think it becomes very obvious who your hands-on people are going to be that are going to be able to build the trail, and who your admin people are going to be, the ones that are going to deal with the media, deal with maybe posts on social media. It just becomes obvious who's going to take those roles and run with them, because you may have people that are much better to deal with administrative duties or looking for funding than they are driving a tractor or running a box blade. So that kind of becomes obvious once you have your little core group of volunteers. How much time do I have, Nancy? I feel like I'm talking really fast.
You're about out. If you have time, are you?
Okay, no, I've got more. Okay, so as far as I just want to reiterate something that Mike already mentioned, and that was the Orca software. One of the things that we did do when we were educating ourselves was to look up, and you can do this online. You don't have to go to a county courthouse. You can look up online through this Orca software and see who owns all of the adjacent parcels of land if you're building a trail. And if the trail is deeded to a conservancy, that will immediately show up in that software. We went through the kansasgis.gov software, which is the Orca that Mike is talking about, and we made a list of every adjacent landowner, not necessarily because we wanted to send a mailing list or anything, but mainly just so that we had a comprehensive list of every landowner and their name, mostly just for recognition. Because if you do have some disillusioned people, it's really good to know, are they living next to the trail? How many miles of trail do they live adjacent to? It's just a great resource to have so that you can look and see who the actual landowners are, and you don't have to make a trip to the county. I also have received files from the Register of Deeds at some of the counties if I wanted to go back and look at the actual landowners by title. We've even taken it back as far as 1886 in one county, where we've been able to go back and actually see when the county gave the land over to the railroad. It's just, again, it's about education. It's about having your own little war chest of information that you can present to people when you're called upon. Let me think. Anything else? Am I out of time, Nancy?
Yeah, you really are. Well, we're all out of time, so
Okay, all right.
we'll hopefully pick you up again.
Okay, cool.
Okay, we've got questions for you. So thank you so much, Nancy. Most trails are built on public land, but with limited land available, some trails are being developed, as Mike said, on private land. And Myron Linewetter, our next speaker from Rossville, has tackled these in big ways on the Toad Strangler Trail. So Myron, would you share with us?
Okay, thank you, Nancy. So our trail is the Toad Strangler Trail, and it's located just outside the city limits of Rossville, Kansas. And Rossville is a small town of about 1,200 people in Shawnee County, Northwest Shawnee County. So our efforts to build the trail started after one of these very similar types of webinars that was in April of 2021. That was a presentation by Elizabeth Berger. And so that motivated us to get started. And we are the sponsoring organization of this trail is the Rossville Community Foundation. So one of our board members offered to allow his private property for a trail, you know, if we could work out the potential liability issues. So we started basically initially working on the liability issues, and then subsequently actually started the trail clearing and beginning the process of building the trail. So that took about 2 years, and along the way we learned a lot of lessons, made a lot of mistakes, but probably the main thing that we learned was kind of the tricks of putting the public access trails on private property. So I'm borrowing a lot of these bullet points in my presentation from the Kansas Agritourism Promotion Act. They have a very good website. It's the Kansas Department of Commerce and Agritourism. I'll give you that website at the end of the meeting. But the first thing is common sense, and a lot of this has already been addressed by the other speakers about where to put the trail and the types of surfaces and everything. But my main recommendation under common sense is to ask people for assistance. And there's certainly two of the best experts in Kansas on this webinar. That's Mike Goodwin and the Kansas Trails Council, and Elizabeth Berger from the Sunflower Foundation. They were extremely helpful to us and encouraging us. But certainly anyone who's on this website, I think, is willing to provide information and answer questions. So as far as the actual statutory protection for public access trails on private land, the main mechanism that we use is the Kansas Agritourism Promotion Act, and that requires registration. It's on the website. It's actually a fairly simple process to go through. It's free, and the person that's in charge of that program is Kelsey Wendling, and Kelsey is very helpful and very enthusiastic about these projects, and so she was a really important resource for us. So there's also another Kansas statute, KSA 58-3201, which is very similar, but it's another statutory protection for private landowners that limits liability. So those two specific different statutes that are available. So under the Agritourism Promotion Act, you have to put up specific signage warning about the liability issues, and so that's one of the requirements of the Agritourism Act. Those signs are actually available. They're pre-printed. They're available. We got ours through the Kansas Horse Council, and so that was a fairly easy part of the process. Waivers and releases for our trail, which is just for kind of general use. We don't require any waivers or releases. We don't think it's really generally practical for trails, but certainly it may be a possibility if you were going to do a special event, 5K run or some special event, you may want to consider waivers. But in general, we haven't used waivers for anything. So to get into the actual legal part of it, the business entity that you choose, some people have formed LLCs, limited liability corporations, or other different types of legal entities as far as to provide some coverage for the liability issues. So that's a legal question that requires a competent attorney to provide legal advice for that. And so we certainly went through that process. And so I strongly recommend that you do that as part of this establishing these trails on private property. So on top of that, there's actual agritourism liability insurance that you can get, which is completely separate, or a personal liability umbrella policy. Again, those you would want to check with an insurance agent to talk about those. And so finally, what the final solution that we came up with for our Toad Strangler Trail was that we wrote up a lease, or our attorney wrote up a lease for the city of Rossville, so that we were covered under the Kansas Tort Claims Act also. So our landowner is protected that way. And then with the Agritourism Act, and then he has a personal liability umbrella policy that he uses for all of his other property. He already had that. So with the combination of all that, he feels comfortable with his allowing public access to his property. And so we were able to open the Toad Strangler Trail just in the last few months. And it's become quite a popular place in Rossville. It's just a beautiful trail that's along Cross Creek, which runs south out of Rossville, and we're hoping to continue to expand that and continue ideally all the way down to the Kansas River, but that may take a little while. But in the meantime, we're enjoying the Toad Strangler Trail and the process that it's been through. So that's all I have, Nancy.
That's fantastic. You've covered a lot, and I see a lot of clues for things that we can include in the follow-up. Thanks, Myron. Making trails accessible is an issue, and something every trail builder needs to consider. How ADA affects trail design is a topic that Jeff Bender is eminently qualified to discuss. Jeff is the regional supervisor with Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, and he'll take a few minutes to talk about the overall concepts involved with making trails accessible to everyone. In a later webinar, we'll probably go into more details about ADA requirements. But Jeff, thanks for your overview.
Thank you. Sorry if it's kind of echoey. I had to evacuate my office because of some repairs and construction. So the universal design is the concept people use when we're talking about accessibility and facilities, whether it's sidewalks, trails, whatever. But universal design just makes everything, products and environments easier for everybody to move through life. And I like that. I'm stealing that quote from Richard Louv out of his book, The Nature Principle, same guy that wrote The Last Child in the Woods, but it sums it up. And this picture that I'm showing here is an example of that. That is one family, 4 generations of one family on the Flint Hills Trail, from great grandpa to little tyke. And there's the example of why this is important and why you should think about it. You should consider making your trail accessible to anyone, and it will affect all of us eventually. Real quickly, everybody thinks of the ADA requirements. ADA is Americans with Disabilities Act. ABA, Architectural Barriers Act, goes back to 1968, and that's the requirements that federal agencies have to adhere to. ADA is for local, state governments, private, and everybody else. But as far as with trails, it's pretty much the same. And the real good guide that's available, it's out on the internet, is in the blue link there. The U.S. Access Board's Guide to Outdoor Developed Areas. It looks like this with the green cover. And it's a real good one, has good illustrations that explain everything. Let's go to the next slide there. So the first question, do all the trails have to be ADA accessible? No, not necessarily, even for the federal agencies. These 4 exceptions can apply to any trails, whether it's practical to build due to the terrain, whether you can accomplish it with prevailing construction practices. And that doesn't mean just what you're capable of doing, but normal construction practices. Does it alter the function or purpose of the setting or the facility? If you're wanting to build a high-speed mountain bike trail or any true mountain bike trail with lots of ups and downs and things, doesn't have to be ADA. It would change the function of the trail. It would change the setting maybe to be able to build it to an accessible standard. The 4th thing that gives you like an exception is it could be precluded by law. For instance, the Wilderness Act, that refers to the federal congressional wilderness designation to some of the big federal areas. There could be endangered species, NEPA, or national historic laws that preclude being able to build a fully accessible trail in a lot of areas. But if you meet one of those exceptions, it should be documented though. Let's go to the next slide there. So getting down to the dirty, I'll show you this. We'll leave it on the program, but here's what it deals with and the things to consider in order to build your trail accessible to everyone. The surface, firm and stable, and that's number 1. And it's pretty simple. Don't try to overthink it. It's very simple. If you think you're going to build a trail out of wood chips, you shouldn't. Just don't do it. People used to do that a lot. It's not firm and it's not stable. Loose, rounded gravel is not stable. It moves. So it's pretty, limestone screenings, it gets firm and it's stable. There's reasons for all those. The clear tread width, 36 inches, passing spaces, no tread obstacles. And when you go through the standards and in the guidebooks and everything, something to note, there's a difference between the man-made materials for surfacing, whether your surface is concrete versus an earth, soil, natural surface. In the natural surface settings, you can have tread obstacles here or there up to 2 inches. But the more man-made it is, the less obstacles it should be. Openings, when you read the guidebooks, it talks about openings, it's in reference to drains and also spaces between boards on bridges. And that's 1/2 inch max in all cases. And then Mike will get into, and you'll understand in some of the other webinars, the running slope of the trails. You can build, to make a trail accessible, you can have a running slope of 0 to 5% of any length, whether it's 100 feet to 100 miles. When you start exceeding the 5%, you start restricting the length of that segment of the trail, the length that it can be in order to meet accessibility guidelines. And in that aspect right there, I'll stop and say, when Mike gets into on some of his other webinars talking about building sustainable trails, if you're building a sustainable trail, in most cases, you will be building a trail that's mostly accessible. They go hand in hand. And if you're building an accessible trail, it's probably it's likely a sustainable trail also. And so if you follow the basics of trail building sustainable trails, in a lot of cases, it's going to be accessible or very close to it, because you're building a contour trail. You're not doing really steep sections. Cross slope is another thing to address, and then the resting intervals that are provided every now and then when you exceed 5%. Let's go to the next slide. And lastly, a thing that a lot of times is forgotten or not thought about is at your trailheads, the federal agencies. And when I say the federal agencies, don't forget that most of our state parks, not all of them, but most are on federal lands. So when we do trails and trailhead facilities and things like that, even in our state parks, if it's on the federal land, we're supposed to adhere to the ABA guidelines. And the thing is, with trailheads, it's really, you need to construct an outdoor accessible route. And all that is really, you're connecting all the facilities at that trailhead together and to the trail itself. So this picture along the Flint Hills Trail is in Admire. You can't see it, but off to the right is concreted accessible parking spaces that link with the sidewalk, that links with the shelter, that links with the restroom, and all those things. And we're going to be installing a ADA drinking fountain, and we would have an ADA table under that shelter. So all those things are connected with an accessible route. And that is a really quick overview.
That was masterful. Thank you so much, Jeff. And now we've hurried people because we wanted time for you to interact with the speakers and ask your questions. And Elizabeth, if Mike is the godfather of trails, then certainly Elizabeth Berger is the fairy godmother of trails as the vice president of Healthy Communities for Sunflower Foundation. And Elizabeth, thank you for making this possible. All of it.
Oh my goodness, bibbity bobbity boo. Well, first we'll clarify. I think we go back and forth. Mike Goodwin, guru of trails, Jeff Bender, godfather of trails, but I think I'm just like the head trail talker. Well, thank you, all of our speakers. You did a fantastic job. I know how hard it is to condense so much information into a short amount of time. Let me ask our Zoom guru, and that would be Nancy, if people would prefer to not put it in the chat box and verbally ask, do we have the ability to do that?
Sure, just that
Okay.
they can unmute themselves. Yep.
All right, so you can, I think what might makes this most efficient, if you have a question that you want to ask verbally, unmute yourself and put your hand up, and I'll try to flip through or just start grunting. But in the meantime, a couple of things that came up in the chat box I wanted to point out. Lacey, we asked Lacey the question. So she said they did a trail map of Independence. Okay, my first thought was, did they have to hire an expensive consultant to do that? Nope. Did you all see your answer? Is pretty awesome. they went and hung out in a brewery for a couple of hours and dreamed and used Eagle View and Kinet Explorer. Lacey, do you want to share anything more about that? Because we got quite a few questions about this trail map.
Just that it can be very simple. We just wanted a way to show people that are, very visual people what we were talking about. Because if you're not in the trail world, sometimes people are very literal on what a trail means, and they don't think of just connectors of qualifying as a trail. And so that's kind of what we did. So we tried to use some color coding to make it even easier. So if it was just like a bike lane or like a designated bike route, we still called that it's still a trail. And so we marked that in a certain color, and then other colors that were, we'd have to get out there and physically build a natural surface trail or a concrete trail or something like that. We color coded it in a different way so that people could get a visual of collectively what we were talking about with building a trail network.
And for that visual, did you literally snap screenshots from, say, the Eagle View or Google Earth and then just paint in the lines? I mean,
the program is something that I have access to at the city. So I would encourage people to reach out to, cities, counties, organizations that might already have the software. They might help you with putting it together, but I can pull up basically maps of the city, and then it's just a little tool that I can draw a red line or a blue line or a purple line, and so that's what we did.
Elizabeth,
yes.
I might just pop in. So if you don't work for a city who has software like that, and you're just an aspiring trail builder, Google Earth is your friend. You can look at any part of our world, including Kansas, and see all kinds of information on that screen. You can also draw in tentative routes for your trail, and you can really play around a lot, and all can be done at your desktop. So it's free. And so if you don't have access to expensive software, there are other alternatives out there.
Thank you, Mike. And John Rankin, you were given a thumbs up. Did you have a question, or were you just affirming the value of Google Earth?
I was affirming the value of Google Earth and Mike's knowledge thereof. I would also add GIS, and I think that's what you're talking about. But if as Mike said, if your county doesn't have GIS, the state GIS usually fills in those areas. So for what it's worth.
Thanks. And Clayton, thank you for all the information you're putting in the chat box. And we will have the chat available. It may not be pretty, but the information will be in there for after this call, including some of the links I've put in. Someone had sent me a question to ask Nancy Nelson about, you had indicated sort of the division of labor, some people to do the research, some people to maybe do some promotions or social media, some people to actually build the trail. How did you actually divvy that up? And how was sort of the leader proclaimed? Like, was there a self-proclaimed leader that then began assigning tasks?
There really wasn't a self-proclaimed leader. It just ended up that the men that wanted to work on the trail, that had the equipment, they kind of became the hands-on, boots on the ground. And then I think because we needed to coordinate our communication and our efforts somehow, because you can't really go and just, I mean, you have to have some source for funding. You can't just start and go build trail. I think after we all communicated and met several times, and we kind of did the little education thing among ourselves, it just became apparent that they were going to be the doers and the getter done and the hands-on, and I was going to end up being the voice of the group and the kind of the admin person. So it just kind of all fell into place. We didn't really assign any tasks to speak of. It just kind of happened. And I think the more that you sit down with your group of volunteers and you're communicating, it's going to be pretty obvious who does want to talk and who doesn't want to talk and who would rather just build trail. Hopefully it works out that way for everyone else.
Great information. And we have a question from Myron. We'll do really quickly. And then Clayton, we've got you and you're willing to vocalize. So the question that came to me to ask Myron was about the agro-tourism, and they just wanted to make sure they understood that you don't have to actually have livestock or anything that's farmy to maybe get your trail listed as an agritourism site.
Well, in our case, it just so happened that the trail was adjacent to productive agricultural land. So I think that ideally, there would be some agricultural connection there. Kelsey would be able to answer that question specifically. But I think that their goal is to get public access to private property for hunting or tourism. I think it's a pretty vague, open-ended statute. And so I think they can make it fit. So I guess that's the bottom line.
No, thank you. I think you answered that perfectly, because it was, if your trail was adjacent to some productive farmland, good, but you didn't have to intentionally like put llamas on the trail to make an agritourism site.
No, but Kelsey did recommend that we put some signs along our trail that said, here, this is a field of soybeans, and this is, this is corn, so that there is some type of agritourism, agricultural education, but it's not mandatory to participate in that program.
Okay, thank you. Clayton, you want to ask your question? And then Mike, it looked like you went off mute to say something as well.
Actually, I was just going to make a comment there on, we discussed earlier, I think we phrased it as an admin for people that speak to the community and engage in these public meetings, you're using for the face for that versus other tasks. Just coming from the advocacy world, I would stress that it may seem obvious, but motivated is not the same thing as effective. When you're choosing those roles of who's going to be at these public meetings, what are they going to say? When the newspaper asks for a contact for an interview, focus on effective, not motivated.
And it's always great to have concise talking points that the group agrees on, for sure. Thank you. That's really good insight, Clayton. Mike, did you want to add something?
Well, actually, maybe it's a question for Nancy. We were hoping, I guess, to let everybody know how they could contact each of us. In my case, info@kansastrailscouncil.org would be an email address to use for me. And are we going to add these somehow later?
I'll add them. We failed to add them to the end of the PowerPoint, but they'll be there when they get posted. Perfect.
And I just want to say, if anybody needs assistance with these early stage questions that we posed today, that's kind of what we do. And so please feel free to reach out to the Kansas Trails Council.
Jeff Bender, getting a lot of props for the gorgeous photos in your PowerPoint, and folks are wondering which ones are proprietary and which ones can they shamelessly steal and use for the nefarious purpose of promoting trails worldwide.
That's a good question. I have to look at each one again. Most of them are stealable. Let's put it that way. Because
you stole it.
Taken on my state phone or somebody else's, or I've stolen them from somebody else already.
Excellent. And I appreciate someone jumping in and commenting a little bit more in the chat box. But Mike, I'd like to hear your take on this again, because you mentioned right off, when you're thinking about finding those slivers of land, and I know we're at 1 o'clock right now, so by all means, you are formally excused. Nancy, I'll let you say your spiel, and then I'm gonna ask Mike the question for those who can stay on.
Oh, no, that's fine. Exactly what you're saying. We'll stay here for as long as anybody wants to be here.
And then Nancy will be sending out a follow-up email with the link to this recording and the chat room and all other resources. She is a marvel at doing that. So Mike, you started out saying less than 2% of our land is public in Kansas. We have to look for those slivers. Then you said, look for the creeks and bodies of water. Elaborate just a little bit more. It's not just because it's pretty.
Yeah, so when we start out thinking about, okay, where can I build a trail? We think of traditional things like parks and other public sort of tracts of land, but almost every town across the state has a creek running through it, partly because they created the town because of the creeks back in the day. So those are also generally public right of way, or there's a bandwidth beside each side of the creek. So yes, they can flood. You have to be careful about some of the locations, but you can always design the trail around the periphery to make that work. And the city of Topeka is a great example of that. The Shunga Trail, which many of you from the area know, is a concrete trail that goes east or southwest to northeast all the way through the city along the Shunga Creek. And it's sort of nestled along one edge of the creek. Lots of towns are doing the same sort of thing. I noticed Allison was here, I think, from Jetmore earlier. They're looking at building a trail along the creek in Jetmore. Jim Curtis was here, I think, earlier. He's looking at building a trail along the creek in Kinsley. So this happens a lot. And there's one, Elizabeth, this combines the private land we talked about with Myron out in St. Francis. So there are a lot of examples where this can really work. And it's just kind of a natural location. Besides that, it's next to water, which I think most trail people think, oh, this is cool. It's pretty and you got water down there. It's just a natural spot.
The term is what? It's a positive focal point?
We call it a positive control point. Positive control points are things you want the trail user to experience. And so your job as a trail builder or trail designer is to locate all those things that are really cool and then design the trail so that the trail user gets to experience them when they use the trail.
As we're talking about this public-private land, and this could be for, Myron answered the question in the chat box about the access to the land, but there is a bigger question. I don't think any of the trails you've mentioned about being on private property, the land itself isn't donated, correct, Mike? Can you talk to us just a little bit about the easement, the trail easement or the right-of-way that's being used? It's not sort of a donation of a huge parcel of land or the purchase.
Yeah, it certainly could be either. Most of the time, you're not going to find that unless, and the exception I think would be if the landowner wants a tax write-off for a donation of that easement, there may be some legal, and again, to Myron's point, a lawyer is very important in this process. So yeah, there may be some conveyance of the actual land parcel, but most of the time not. I think most of the time we're talking about an easement or a lease or some other legal memorandum that is an understanding that you have access for the usage to which you've designed the trail. Myron, I don't know if you've thought about that further or not.
Yeah. So, So in our case, this was about 40 acres of productive agricultural land. However, the portion that was right along the creek, which fortunately is beautifully maintained in a riparian buffer with big trees and beautiful area, this is kind of getting down in the weeds, but that portion of the agricultural property is not productive. And so it's not taxed, and that's what it's used for. It has no agricultural use. So therefore it's available for these types of projects. And so and again, ours is just one example. I don't know if that would apply in every situation, but that's how it worked out in our situation.
Jeff
Elizabeth?
Bender, looks like you wanted to jump in.
Well, a couple things. Number one, many of the rail trails, the rail trail entities or the entities that have it rail bank don't own the land. Many just have the right of way. And then when it comes to easements, so in other words, the landowners actually own the land, but the entity that has the trail has it rail banked for use. So they have a right of way on it. And then with many properties, it might be private property or city property or whatever, there may be easements in place on properties. Maybe it's an easement for a road. It might be an easement for a sewer line. It doesn't, just because some entity has an easement on somebody's land doesn't mean it can be used for anything like a trail. It means that they have an easement for whatever use that easement was written for. It doesn't mean you can do just anything on an easement.
Yeah, a good example, Jeff, of that would be utility easements. If the power company has a transmission line going through the city, it's for that express purpose to be used for the transmission line. And it's possible to also then get permission to build a trail there, but then you've got to deal with the requirements of the easement itself for the power line and make sure it's not in any way conflicting with that use. But it can be done. And again, to Myron's point, I think earlier, you just need to really step through all of these questions early on, maybe hire a lawyer, really talk about the legal side of it. It's not something that's very easy, but it's doable. But you need some professional guidance, I think, generally, when you're talking about private land.
And just shout out to Myron, who has been really generous with his time and expertise around this matter, and has a one pager that we can probably make available when we send out the resources that sort of talks through what they did. I'll say really briefly as a funder, and we'll talk a lot more about funding in a future trail webinar, because that's worthy of a whole hour. You know, it is really critical, of course, to go through all these steps about who or what owns the land and or the easement and right of way, who's going to take care of it. All of that typically needs to be figured out before you would approach a funder, whether it's a private foundation, a public foundation, a state agency. They're going to want to know all that before they hand over any grant dollars, for a lot of reasons. You know, one of them might be even CYA. They want to make sure that grant dollars aren't building a trail on someone else's land. And I joke about that, but I do get calls from enthusiastic trail talkers that, Elizabeth, we want to build a trail. Do you have money so we can build a trail? Okay, let's back up. Where is it? And they tell me where it is. Okay, well, who owns the property? And then there's silence. And then they say, oh, that's a good question. So as tedious as these steps are, they're really fundamental in getting the dollars needed to build the trail. Lots of good stuff in the chat box. People offering to help each other. I love it. I'm checking for any last questions that people may have sent me to ask our speakers before we. Okay, looks like one more. Oh, Myron's very generously put his phone number into the chat box. People want to ask about that. Okay, so I did get one question at the very beginning that I missed, but I think it's kind of been answered. And if I haven't, if we haven't answered it, let us know. It's really about this whole idea of mapping and sort of confirming that you don't need to hire someone to figure out where your trail needs to be. And so I'm seeing nodding heads, and I think that's really critical to get across, because that's at least one place where you can save a little money. So Mike, do you want to have any last words on that, or Jeff?
I'll throw in real quick. As a public land manager, somebody wants to come to us and say, we'd like to build a trail on your state park or or on your state or county or city, this or that. As a land manager, the first thing I'm gonna want is like, what do you want to build and where are you wanting to build it? And I want to see it on Google Earth, period. Is people in jobs, anything to do with government and land management, we use Google Earth every day. There isn't a day goes by I don't pull up Google Earth for something in the middle of phone conversations or working on a plan for something. It's like, we want to see it on Google Earth so we can see where it lies in relation to the features and other things on the land. Simple as that.
Yeah, Jeff, I agree. Google Earth is our friend, and I use it extensively too. I think this relates to one of the things we really like to talk about with volunteer trail builders as opposed to contractors or even land managers. But we encourage at every step of the way when you're contemplating building a trail, maybe it's even more important in those early stages, as Elizabeth said, to work with the land manager. Many of the trails happen spontaneously by a user group or a trail champion who wants to build a trail, but they don't own the land. And so there's always the land manager that needs to be involved. And I can't stress that enough. And the land manager needs to be involved every step of the way through the process of building a trail, from the earliest days of I'm thinking about and building a trail to, okay, now how do we start putting concrete down or turning the dirt or whatever it might be. So there's this relationship that you have to develop between the trail developer and the land manager to be sure that everybody is on the same page and has permission to do what they are going to do on the public land parcel. It's very important.
And you're making me think of one more thing, and Nancy alluded to this several times, is having your arsenal of information. I think you called it your war chest of information about the some of the values of trails. And if you're thinking about the people that live near them that may not be initially thrilled about it, having those data available that show that, trails typically reduce any amount of crime because you have sort of public policing happen. Knowing that, what it does for property values and things like that. I think we as a bunch of trail talkers do have to remember that initially, not everyone is thrilled with that. Now, usually most of them come on board, right, Mike? Like or Jeff, you see the people not thrilled about a trail that a year later, once it's built, they're out there on their bike or they're picking up trash. But it's good to have that war chest of information in the beginning. I don't see any more things in the chat box. You all have, you're probably got low blood sugar, or you might be in your postprandial lunch stupor. I don't know, but you have been great. I do want to take one moment. If there's any comments or shout outs you want to do, like, hey, we're having a trail ride next Saturday or something like that. You got an open forum here. You just got to be quick on the mic. So I'm comfortable with silence. I'll wait 5 seconds here and let anyone shout out anything they want to say.
I did think of one other tip for the newer people is over the past 2 years, I've seen a sea change from KDOT in the active transportation area. I used to look at them as an information hole. If they were involved, it wasn't necessarily good news. That's totally changed. So if you're looking for a resource, I would highly advise to reach out with the Active Transportation Committee from KDOT. They're a very good resource now.
Especially any trails that could be used for transportation purposes, bicycling and other type things. All the rail trails, any shared use path type things. Get on their website. They've got a lot of good resources on there now. They've
Thank you
really brought it together with their active transportation plan in the past year.
People
Elizabeth,
are
I wonder
putting awesome stuff in the chat box. Keep going. I'm sorry. I wanted to just say I'll make sure Jenny and Mike hear your shout out, Clayton. I would agree. And when we do our webinar on funding, we can talk about that stacking of KDOT, Wildlife and Parks, Sunflower, how you can work together. Anyone else?
Elizabeth, I might just mention anybody who's thinking about funding from Wildlife and Parks through the Recreational Trail Grant. it's my understanding that those applications are due in November. You can check out their website to find out the specifics, but now's the time to be working on that in advance of the November deadline.
Thank you, Mike. That's a great reminder, and we'll talk about this more, but if you go November, there's no way I can do it by then. Guess what? The federal grant applications, KDOT, Wildlife and Parks, they might change a little bit from year to year, but not fundamentally. So it's helpful to at least look at the application, and then with Wild and Parks, go to the public meeting they have. You can learn an awful lot. Okay, looks like people are putting stuff in the chat box. We're all going to be busy going to trail stuff. Nancy?
I have
Ready
one
for
more
lunch?
thing. I usually quote, end with a quote, and I wasn't going to today, but Jeff Bender mentioned a quote that Elizabeth has used. Reconnection to the outside world is fundamental to human health, well-being, spirit, and survival. And that's by Richard Louv. And that may or may not be the quote you were thinking of, Jeff.
It's a different one, but it works.
Thank you, everybody, and look for an email from me with all the good things. And thank you all for the resources.
Thanks, Nancy.